In Baltimore, Maryland, there's a small group of Benedictine sisters who, back in 2010, found themselves in the midst of a modern-day Christmas story. It seems that the United Way of Baltimore called up these sisters and asked them to provide shelter to an 8-month pregnant Muslim woman seeking asylum in the United States. Amina was a woman from Afghanistan who was forced to flee her home because she was pregnant, unmarried, and her life was in danger. Now, it was a mystery to all as to how she arrived in Baltimore, but when she came seeking a place to stay, the sisters knew that they had to do something to keep her safe. They heard she had been through such trauma on her journey, and they believed that sending her to a shelter would be devastating to her. It was Christmas, and they realized that the story they were celebrating was happening again right in their midst. And it was on the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6th, Little Christmas, that Amina gave birth to a boy by the name of Asim. It was a powerful and profound experience for this small group of sisters. It made the Christmas message become so real. It reminded them of 2,000 years ago when a small, bewildered, and afraid family escaped from that megalomaniac Herod. If you go to the internet and look up this Benedictine sisters website, you'll see a picture of 99-year-old Sister Estelle holding the newborn. Now, it wasn't a cave. There were no shepherds or kings, perhaps a few stars in the heavens, but it was a present-day manger scene, an unmarried pregnant woman in danger, and a child was born. Every year, that manger scene that was just acted out is displayed all over the world on this night. Many of your homes, I'm sure, have them as we celebrate the birth of this child 2,000 years ago. In St. Bonaventure's account of the life of St. Francis of Assisi, he tells us that it was the much-beloved St. Francis who staged the very first crush scene in Greccio, Italy in 1223. Well, it's interesting. Last year, almost 8 centuries later, just outside New York City, there was an attempt to educate and illuminate through art the underlining meaning of this creche scene and what we just saw enacted out. The College of New Rochelle hosted a display entitled Nativity Scenes from the Americas, and the exhibit featured nativity scenes from countries like Latin America, the Caribbean, the American Southwest, and Canada. And the exhibit shattered any sense of sentiment or piety that one could associate with that manger scene. The show's curator, Professor Segura Rico, stated this: "What resonated especially with me as I put the exhibit together was the reminder that the nativity story is about a poor migrant family." In talking to reporters, she said, by focusing on the Americas, and not only on North or South America, the exhibit dismantles notions of others as being alien people. I was enthralled by how these figurative representations of the birth of Christ ground a universal story of divine presence in local contexts. You see, the artists, they blended elements from their own religious traditions and their own cultures. And thus the creches represented were a far cry from the typical nativity scenes that are mass-produced in our factories. Just one example is the Navajo nativity scene, which depicted gifts of tortilla flour and woven blankets, two items that are of highest value to that culture. Eileen Canty is a retired professor of psychology, and she collected nativity scenes from 90 countries and 40 states. She donated thousands of these to the exhibit, but interestingly enough, she keeps dozens of them in her Manhattan apartment on display. And when the reporters asked her why she did this, she said, "I tell them Christ is born every day. These nativity scenes from different lands and cultures teach us about the beauty, the creativity, and the dignity of all human lives." She said that she would meditate on the similarities and differences in each creche that led her to realize that we all have different gifts and that all can be used to do God's work. We gather together this Christmas Eve to celebrate the Incarnation, that extremely radical idea that God would so long to be in relationship with us that God would immerse God's self in all of creation. Amin, the pregnant, unmarried Muslim woman, was vulnerable. The manger scene is ultimately a scene of vulnerability. The Holy Family has been turned away from shelter, forced to give birth in a stable, exposed to the elements, and later they fled death at the hands of Herod. It offers to us a powerful reminder that God is present in a very special way within our world's most broken, most estranged, most forsaken peoples and places. I wonder if God was really saying something to those sisters in Baltimore. The child was born on the feast of the Epiphany. In the 20th century, the word epiphany found a new understanding in the thought of Emmanuel Levinas, a French philosopher who has had an enduring impact on theology and ethics. Levinas believes that we experience an epiphany whenever we look into another person's face. Our face-to-face encounters, he says, make us realize that we have a deep moral obligation to one another. The manger scene reminds us that all faces are reflections of the face of God, that all bodies are the body of Christ, especially those broken by violence and warmongering and social injustice, whether in our own streets or in the streets of faraway lands. This creche calls us to look into the faces of all of our brothers and sisters and to recognize that we are all migrants searching for safety and a sense of home. It implores us to honor and care for one another on the journey. We are all God's beloved, sharing a common humanity. So let us ask ourselves this evening, how did the birth 2,000 years ago, this birth of Christ we celebrate, how did it change the world? Historian Rodney Stark argues that there's one huge factor that helped capture the attention of the ancient world: Christianity's revolutionary emphasis on mercy. He writes, "In the midst of squalor, misery, illness, and the anonymity of the ancient cities, Christianity provided an island of mercy and security. It started with Jesus. In contrast, in the pagan world, showing mercy was a defect of character unworthy of the wise and excusable only in those who have not yet grown up. This was the moral climate in which Christianity taught that a merciful God requires humans to be merciful. We come together this evening to celebrate a child born 2,000 years ago who grew into a man who changed the course of history, telling each of us that we have an obligation to look into each other's faces and understand our common humanity and be merciful. The message of this child who became a man, a God-man, that Jesus brought into the world was one of tolerance. As a grown man, he sat and broke bread with lepers and whores, with the poor and those in need of protection. Christ is born every day, in the rich and in the poor, in the unemployed, the powerless, the weak, the drug addict, and the prostitute. Christ is born every day in Manhattan and in Syria. A pregnant, unmarried Muslim woman in danger for her life found a haven with a small group of sisters. It was Christmas again. There was a manger scene. Christ was born. If we look around, Christ is born every single day.